Thanks a lot, and thanks a lot for having me. And it's really with great pleasure to be here today and to share with you some thoughts that we had over the years with my colleagues on the different projects on ethics, on the microbiome, and especially also of vulnerable populations. So as you heard already, with my group, we work on malnutrition and especially on undernutrition. And as you see on this map of the world, this is a syndrome that is mostly found in sub-Saharan Africa and also in Southeast Asia. And therefore, coming from Switzerland, it's obvious that I collaborate with other colleagues to basically work on this subject. And so far, we have 3 bigger projects, one in the Central African Republic and in Madagascar, a second one in Ethiopia at the border with Somalia, and the third one in Laos, where we try to answer these questions and work very closely with our local collaborators and also with the communities. So if we think about such type of research, are there any ethical constraints? And obviously there are many. I think first and foremost, as we work with children per se are already a vulnerable population, which leads to many ethical questions that have to be raised. Second, we often work also in a context of poverty, and this context per se is also leading to different questions that we have to ask ourselves. And as you can see, I'm someone from Switzerland, a white person. So when I do this type of research, I work in a different country, in a different culture, often also in a different context. And this also leads to a lot of questions on all fronts, actually, how we should behave and how we should do such a research. So let me now, however, go back first to the microbiome and what is really so special about it. And I think here there are several points that came up already by other researchers also in the past, but which I think are quite important to me. And the first one is that so far microbiome research was pretty basically low in risk. We normally took stool, and so we really had not too much basically risk to look then at these biospecimens. However, this is changing as we look more and more also in other compartments of the gastrointestinal tract, as example, the small intestine. And I think this comes with more questions also like regarding how far can we go to basically get samples to generate baseline knowledge. Another important question that I often ask myself is if the microbiome is actually human, if it's personal or if it's part of the environment. As you all know, strains are shared between the environment, between animals, different humans. So who actually or to whom a strain belongs becomes quite a complicated concept. And I think this is really important if we think about who owns microbial strains. We heard already a bit about that by Katie Amato, but I think it's really important to ask these questions so that we can also see how benefit sharing should be achieved and how this actually can be done in different contexts. I think another important point is also how it is culturally acceptable and desired regarding stool. This is very different in different communities we work in, and it's also different regarding different biospecimens that are collected. And finally, and we heard already about that from Katie Amato, I think it's also really important to ask ourselves the questions, do people really know what they consent to? In microbiome research, as in any clinical research, we often ask for consent by the people. We try to explain what we're doing in the project. We often also ask for reuse of the samples or for biobanking. And I think there it's really a big risk because often nor us as researchers nor the people that participate to our research are really aware what we could later on do with the samples. And I think that's something that should really be discussed and also reflected on in the wider community, but also in each project. And last, and that's something that's quite close to my heart, and I was really happy that Katie already talked about it, I think there's also this question of open access and of basically who owns really microbiome strains and also microbiome data. So who owns now this microbiome data? We heard that normally you have to make it open access. I'm in theory also for open access data because I think there's a lot of benefits to it. But the same also for microbial strains. Normally we say it's good that we share them because then we can share also the benefits. We can basically increase knowledge. But I think that becomes quite a big problem if we think about next generation probiotics. And as we heard already, the idea that maybe some of these samples can, in a context or another, be used for basically therapies thereafter. And there, until a few months back, I would have told you, well, but you can't actually patent a microbe, but that was proven wrong because this is actually true in Switzerland, but this isn't true in other countries. And I therefore think that it's really important to really think about this benefit sharing quite intensely and also in each context specifically again. So a question that we discussed also quite often with my colleagues is basically about the Nagoya Protocol. So as you know, Nagoya has been set up to basically protect against biopiracy. But often this is at the nation level. So basically like a government will decide, can something be shared or not? And it doesn't really take into account what's happening on a subnational level. We already heard about that as well, but I think it's really important to think who can really have the right to grant access for research. Is it government? Is it the community? Is it maybe like a family head? Is basically like the microbiome a global resource or not? Which constraints should we apply or we shouldn't? And I think those are really complicated questions where the answer will probably be different in every specific context. And I think there's also a big work that is being done right now on this with the different countries, especially also regarding the Nagoya Protocol. Another point that's very close to my heart is this question of open access. I already told it, and I think there it's really important to say, is open access data really fair? Because as we heard, the collection of the samples is quite labor intensive. This is true for non-human primate, but it's also true for basically samples that are of human origin, as an example. And I think there's quite big imbalance if you look then at knowledge, infrastructure, or funding that different groups and people might have. So here we can think within a country, let's say in Switzerland, there's really well-established groups that have maybe like 10 different postdocs, or small groups that maybe gathered all this data, but then don't have all the funding and the manpower to analyze them on their own. Or this can also be across the north and the south, where, as an example, a small group in the global south generated maybe the data that will then be taken by someone in the global north for a study, and as already mentioned, may not even include the people that generated and curated this data in the author list. So I think there's really a lot that should be discussed there, and we should probably also think about a better way of sharing the benefit on this level. Along the same side is also this question, what is happening with shotgun sequencing? Right now, there's also the policy that all shotgun sequencing should be published, but often you can't really completely clean it from human sequences. And I think also there is a question, is this really safe for the participants? Or do we basically tell the participants that nothing will be released, which is basically really identifying, but in the end, we still do, just we are maybe not really aware that we're doing so. So these are some general points I wanted to make about the microbiome, but as you heard, I work since many years in low and middle income countries, and I think there we face some other issues. And what is very special there is that we often have a political context which may be different from what we know from our own country. We may also be faced with humanitarian crisis. The social context may vary or not, depending on where we are. And there may also be cultural differences, including, as an example, religious differences. And obviously, there's quite a lot of power gradients. So how do we really behave, and how do we best collaborate in such a setting? So to give you a personal example, when I started on the Afribiota project, this was in 2016, and basically we worked in Bangui, the capital city of the Central African Republic, and in this country right then, there was still a civil war. And what happened is that we landed basically in the middle of a refugee camp and came to look at the microbiome of undernourished children. And looking out of the window, I really asked myself a few questions, like, is it ethical what I'm doing, what I'm actually here for? And is it really the most important thing to look at the microbiome of these children right now, or would they maybe need something completely different? And on the other hand, there's also the question, is it ethical to stop? Is it ethical to not work on the microbiome just because there are other hurdles around? Or should you maybe find a way as we can basically combine both of them? And a similar situation also arose when we were working in Ethiopia, because there's regular droughts. And once we came and wanted to collect samples, but there was a serious drought ongoing, and came then again the question, like, is it okay that we do our research, or should we maybe rather engage into humanitarian aid in this specific situation? And I think there is often the question, like, how to juggle and manage expectation in these communities. And are we researchers or are we humanitarian workers? Obviously, we can't become humanitarian workers, but I still think it's important to see what we can do actually to really also help the communities we work in, and basically really engage in a true collaboration on all different fronts. And I think there it's really important to do transdisciplinary research so that we ourselves as scientists maybe can do something, that we have the possibilities as a broader consortium to really contribute and also meet the expectations of the populations we work with. So we spoke about bridging differences in context, but I think we also have to bridge differences in cultures. So here you see a picture from Lausanne, and above a picture from the field sites that we work in Ethiopia. And I think to really bridge these different worlds, it's really important to have mutual respect and understanding, as basically in any collaboration. But I think a point that is very important to me is really to have full transparency to everyone involved and to really be aware of all the power imbalances. And I think something that worked extremely well for us over the years has been to really create win-win situations. And for that, to have a really open communication, what is perceived as a win, and also to be aware to have basically fair arrangements. So as an example, to redefine what is considered basically a meaningful contribution. Is it the time spent in the field? Is it the funding that is basically provided? Or is it maybe anything else that is really needed for the successful completion of such a project? So this win-win situations, I think we had a beautiful first example with the first talk that we heard today. We also had such win-win situations in my own basically like career together with Abdifatah Mohamed that you see here on the very left. And this is a concept that I've learned from Jakob Zinstag, who is a professor at the Swiss Tropical and Public Health Institute. And what he has set up is something extremely simple but extremely powerful, because what he does is that he sets up North-South diets where we have basically researchers from the Global North and the Global South which work jointly on a project. And by that, basically like mutualize what they can contribute to a project, learn from each other, and really lead to the mutual empowerment. And to just in this special example, what happened is that Abdifatah was a master's student when he started, and I was a senior postdoc. And 5 years later, Abdifatah is about to defend his PhD. I've been promoted to assistant professorship. And you see here the pictures from when Abdifatah was leading a mixed team of people from Switzerland, Ethiopia to the field. And when we discussed basically the next steps of how we wanted to collaborate once he would have his own group in Ethiopia in a few months' time. And I think also here, it's really important to know and manage each other's expectations, to have open communications across cultures, but also across hierarchies. So talking about win-win situations, we heard it before, I think it's also important to think about everyone in the team. Not everyone is basically scientists, so maybe not everyone wants a co-authorship, but maybe for them it's something else that they perceive as a win. This can be good working conditions, a sense of community, or other things that are important for them at this specific moment. And I think there in a research project on the microbiome or something else, it's really important to have a constant dialogue to evaluate expectations and really make sure that win-win situations are maintained. So last, bridging knowledge, cultures, and social states obviously also goes to the communities. We had a very nice first talk that went into details on these different aspects. And I think here for me, it's just important to say that in microbiome research for myself, it's really important that we leave no one behind so that everyone is welcome to participate. But at the other hand, that also no one is forced. So basically that we also respect the willingness or not of specific communities, families, or people to participate. And I think when we take such samples, it's really important that we also try to find out what the samplings means for them, so that we integrate cultural beliefs and specificities of every community we work with, that we're also aware that each context is different. So maybe what works in Ethiopia will be completely different in Laos, or even within a village, a family, or a person, the beliefs and basically like the wishes around such research may be completely different. So with this, I think it's really important to say that microbiome research, especially in low and middle income countries, but not only, should always involve also the decision makers and the communities. And I think this is really important that this happens from the start. So when you already design your project, I think it's really important to be sensible to cultural differences and to adapt to what is locally okay. And something that for me has proven quite important is also to work not only with the local colleagues, but also with different disciplines, as an example, anthropologists, local NGOs, governments, hospitals, to really have like a multidisciplinary and also transdisciplinary group of people that can then basically help with putting all the different pieces of the puzzle together. I think what's also important, especially for someone like me that is coming from the global north, is to take time. So many times I got aware that basically taking time is something that is culturally extremely different, and you may be perceived extremely rude if you don't take this time. And I think this also goes along basically adapting to whomever you work with and really make sure that everyone is happy in the collaboration that is set up. So we also heard that the communities wish to restitute the results. I have witnessed this also on several occasions, and it's also something that is really central to the work that we do. So you see here the restitution on the right with the families and the community leaders for the AfriBiota project. But I think likewise, it's also very important to basically restitute the results further up. So you see on the left side also a reunion that we did with the ministry in the Central African Republic. And I think there is extremely important to be honest in what you can promise. So we heard before that there was this microbiome, I think it was called. So it's really important to manage expectations and to also take profit of the situations to really learn for the next projects so that the next project will be even better and include everyone that is really involved. So in conclusion, I try to put together a little framework as myself and also my collaborators see microbiome work in low middle income countries. I think for myself especially, these North-South collaborations are truly important. It's also important to have, whenever possible, inter- and transdisciplinary research, to have a lot of communication and outreach to be sure that everyone really understands what the idea is and what could be done with the samples that are generated. And finally, and very importantly, to be aware of the specificities of each specific context that you're working in, especially if you work with vulnerable populations. So in conclusion, I hope I could raise some thoughts and ideas about the ownership of strains and what risk might be acceptable to take for such research. The importance of really involve communities from the start to manage expectations and to be aware of knowledge gradients and differing views. To always try to have these win-win situations. And finally, something that is extremely close to my heart is these fair partnerships. So to really always think, is what I'm doing right now something that is really fair for all parts? And what I always try to tell my collaborators and students is to say, well, would you be happy if you would be on the other side? Would you still perceive what you're doing as something that is fair? And with this, I would like to thank my group with whom we have this discussion quite frequently. I would also thank to all our collaborators and especially ones highlighted here in bold, with whom we have discussed these ideas quite a lot. And I'm looking forward to discuss more with you all in the later discussion.